Okay, we're going to have some fun tonight. And I actually brought notes, which is very unlike me, right? Nate's seen me preach enough. So this, and Jess has now too, that I promise you it won't be boring. Okay, because I just really believe that God wants to move on you tonight and forever. That like the point of the gospel, the point of Jesus in him coming and dying and then being resurrected was to have a body on earth that would behold him face to face and actually they just literally as Pastor Brian just said, like look exactly like you. Like we would look exactly like Jesus because he's the older brother, right? Our inheritance is actually to walk in the same measure as what Jesus did on earth, and then in greater, and to do greater works. And so I actually, just like a week ago, just over here, because it's just so special. It's honestly so special to be here, because the amount of times that the Lord has just spoke to Melissa and I just like sitting in one of these seats, right? That is just a word that has come like a seed that is now impacting so many. Right, and it's just this thing where we've just learned that you just need to hang around the presence and then people of the presence. Because when you do, it just clears your eyes to see what's possible. Hey? And so that's what tonight is about. So I have notes in the hope that I say something constructive for you to be... be benefited from tonight. And because so what I heard just like as a seed form was I just heard like the Lord say he wants to cause an ignition in us as a people. And I believe that like this is for us who are in this room, but it's also for the nation of Canada. Because he actually wants to ignite something. And the picture that came to mind is like, I can do my own brakes and oil, but outside of that, Melissa's really handy and I am not, which most of you will know when you spend any time with us. But like, I believe that when we get born again, God ignites something in us, right? And we actually become what the world is actually longing for and looking for. Like we actually become a burning witness for him who is burning. His eyes are burning and looking to and fro through the whole earth to strengthen those who are fully committed to him, right? And so I just heard this, like he just wants to ignite us. And I was like, okay, Lord, like, and the picture that came was like an engine. And I know very little about an engine other than without it being ignited and a key coming in and causing the ignition to work, it doesn't do a whole lot. Hey? But when it's ignited, this thing comes alive. And it's actually caused, like it was just this thing, like God actually wants to ignite you because he wants to get somewhere. And we as his body on earth need to get there too. Because he actually wants to use us to get, like there's actually giants, there's things both in the city locally and across the nation that he actually wants to thump. He actually wants to bring rest to. And he actually wants to use our body, his body, us being the body. He actually wants to use his body to bring rest to places that are experiencing the unrest of hell. So if you frame what I'm going to share, because I want to share just a handful of stories and then a couple scriptures just to help go like, just frame it in your spirit to be like, he actually wants to move in Canada. And I feel like just we're seeing like a measure of that. And we're actually praying, God, give us a bigger measuring cup. Hey? And so frame it, everything I'm going to share through this idea, like God actually wants to come and land on you and rest on you and anoint you with power for you to demonstrate the death and resurrection of Jesus. And in so doing, like, a car's engine can't be ignited. Like, any piece of a car doesn't make a full car, right? That's just real. I know that much. But what's wild about this is when in Colossians 2, verse 10, it says, in him you've been made complete. So you weren't handed just a piece of this whole gospel thing. You weren't handed just a piece and only a certain measure that if you were to compare yourself to the Apostle Peter or the Apostle Paul or any other great man or woman of God, you don't have less than them. Like Peter's letter literally says that you were given the same faith as him. Hey? So the ignition that God actually wants you to see is see the reality of Christ in you, the hope of glory. That all of heaven, like the authority of heaven itself has literally been committed to you in the power of the gospel so that you can then go demonstrate the reality of King Jesus here on earth. In Luke 4, Jesus, just before Luke 4, when Jesus is being tempted, so Luke 4 is when he's like, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, but when he's being tempted, sorry, my apologies, it is Luke 4. I'm not good with references, but I can visualize it on the page. So in Luke 4, Jesus is being tempted, right? And the enemy comes and he says like, here, come. And he shows Jesus all the nations, right? And he says, I'll give you authority over all these. And then he says, because it's been handed to me. Right? And if you worship me, I'll give you all of this. And it's actually this thing where like the authority for earth was handed to the enemy through the fall and disobedience and sin of Adam and Eve. Like the enemy actually took authority over the earth. And then Jesus, through his death and resurrection, actually he took back the authority. Hey? And then he gives it to you and I to enforce. But then it actually has to look like something, right? It actually has to have, like the river of the Holy Ghost actually has to flow out of you and impact the world. Like it's actually his great desire that our city streets would be flooded with his praise. Like our families that are experiencing brokenness would actually know his name and know who to call on. What's wild about this is just about 2 years ago, it's just a beautiful story just to help share like the reality of Christ in you, the hope of glory. Because what happened, I was here on a Sunday morning and Nadia came up to me, and is Nadia here? I saw Mike. Mike's here. Nadia's not here tonight. Nadia came up to me and she was like, hey, there's a guy you should hang out with. And you probably heard this story a little bit, but she's like, there's a guy you need to hang out with and just help disciple. And I'm like, okay, cool. So I get his number and we start connecting, and all of a sudden he shows up here. We start discipling him. The first time he ever came to a Sunday morning service, his arm got healed. And I'm like, I know almost very little of his story. He just like showed up over here with his sister, and she had been to a couple praise nights, and she actually had come with Mike and Nadia to a Billy Burke meeting. And so there's all these kind of like seeds planted, and it was beautiful. So through all this, this guy starts being touched by the Lord. And he hasn't fully given his full yes to Jesus yet, until one night he's staying with his sister and he actually starts manifesting an evil spirit. Like he's actually being tormented by the devil, and he falls on the ground at his sister's apartment, and he's like she's telling me, he's scratching at the ground, he's like growling, he's just full on being afflicted by the evil one. And so what does this sister do? She calls a Christian. because you got a fight in you. And so she calls Nadia and Mike, and over the phone, they're just like, oh yeah, we know what to do. And they just prayed for him, and he got totally set free. The enemy actually left his life, and he got born again that night. And so we start connecting. We had the privilege of baptizing him in a terribly cold horse trough at my house. Like, we pulled water from the well, and it was like 4 degrees. He got proper born again. Like, but what's so beautifully stunning about that story is like, if you search his name, it comes up with some pretty wild stuff. Like, Gord, you probably know him. At least your colleagues definitely do. But he got full on born again. And now he's walking right. Like, he's actually like, it's just awesome because his sister had been invited and knew what to do. When she saw her brother on the floor, she was like, oh, I've seen this before at a Billy Burke meeting. Right? The testimony that we steward here, we steward as a church, as individuals, as the body of Jesus, actually can bear fruit that literally will lead people to eternal life. And it's like, what I think the Lord is inviting us to, and what I'd love to propose to you just to test and discern in your own spirit is like I'm actually praying this tonight and in the last couple of weeks for myself, like, God, give me a bigger measuring cup. Because I actually need to see how you see towards the earth. Because I've recognized that what he's done in my life is for me, but is actually also for another. And there's a responsibility on my faith in the stewarding of what he's done that actually can become an encounter for someone else. So it actually says in Mark 4, I'm doing my visual. You can see what I'm thinking. I'm like looking in my brain. Sometimes I joke and I'm like, I know all the other Bible verses except this one. In Mark, there's a Bible verse. It is Mark 4. But Jesus says, by the standard of measure that you measure, it'll be measured to you. And then in Mark 8, there's this really wild thing that happens. So Jesus has walked on the water and he's fed the 5,000. He's done all these miracles and he's actually initiated his disciples to start becoming part of the miracle. Right? He's like, they come to him and they're like, hey, Jesus, there's all these people around and they're hungry and they're starting to get hangry. We should send them away to go get food. And he's like, you feed them. Because from the very time that the Son of God became the Son of Man, his intent was always for you to hold his ministry and authority. Because you as a human being were not created for the fall or for the curse or for the sin nature. You were always created to walk with him face to face. That is your created purpose. It's actually who you're meant to be, the supernatural reality of who he is. God never intended it to be separate from your experience as a human being. And through the body and blood of Jesus, he actually made a gate and led you in, because he's the good shepherd, to go out and find pasture. He actually inaugurated through his body you to come back into a new living way of doing life. Right? Like the born again experience is the beginning of human potential. Because you as a human actually can see him again. The pure of heart see God. So you're actually able, like the veil has gone, so you can actually walk and encounter God himself in the manifestation of who he is. And so he goes with his disciples, and so he's done all these miracles, and he's like, you feed them. They go out and they become part of the miracle. We've seen like some really cool miracles. I don't think I've seen food multiply yet, which is just, and I haven't seen the dead raised. So I have a checklist, a bucket list, right? Because we've seen so many beautiful things in the Lord, but I'm like, I would love to see food multiply because food's wonderful. So it'd just be really fun to experience that. So through all this, just after all these couple things happen, they're now on the boat with Jesus. And Jesus goes, hey, he just, kind of this random talk, but he starts a conversation with the disciples and he says, hey, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the teachers, right? And they're like, uh-oh. And the next verse, they go, okay, do we have enough bread? So he's starting a conversation about the teaching of the Pharisees, and they start thinking about provision because they only had one loaf of bread with them at the time. And they're like, oh no, it's not enough for this journey. It's a very unique story because sometimes the Lord is having a conversation with us, but if we're not diligent to be pursuing him by faith, we're actually having a conversation, or we change the conversation or have the potential to have a conversation with him that he's not wanting to have with you. Okay? Because he's wanting to lead them into a deeper place of revelation. And they start talking about provision. And then he says, hey, how many loaves were left how many did we start with when we fed the 5,000? And they're like, well, just a handful. How many were left? And they're like 7. And then when I fed the other 5,000, how many were left? And they're like, well, it was 12 baskets. And then he says, have your eyes not seen and your ears not heard? And do you not remember? And he's actually like, guys, your eyes and what you've heard, there's an accountability over you. There's a responsibility over you because of what you've seen, heard, and now can remember that is actually meant to take everything that you've seen in the Lord and actually now steward that towards how you perceive and do life. Provision should not be part of this conversation anymore. Are you following me? So when we see healing happen, when Pastor Billy rocks up, when we see it individually ourselves, we lay our hands on someone and they recover either immediately or however God moves, they're then in heaven. God is like, they have seen my nature. They should not turn away and think that it couldn't happen the next time. Are you following me in that? There actually becomes this thing where if we were to allow the weight of that to rest on us, because a disciple is someone who follows the teacher. And therefore, we are able to see what the Father's doing just as Jesus is able to see what the Father was doing. Hey? And so that actually means, because this is true, in Colossians 2:10 says that in him you've been made complete. Complete. 2 Peter says that you lack nothing pertaining to life and godliness. Nothing pertaining to life and godliness, which means you're actually capable. The Bible itself says that you are capable to walk as he did. Amen. And then 1 John actually says that as he is, so are we here on earth. A number of years ago, I was in Slovakia, which is a central kind of Eastern European country that has 2 million people. It's very, very small. And in the middle of it, in the northern part, there's this wild group of Christians. And they live in the middle of nowhere. They somehow, by faith, bought about 40 acres. And now they host some of the biggest worship concerts there. in all of that area of the world. So it's like, if you were to go there, you're like, there's nothing here. And I've had the joy of being there a handful of times. And every major Christian artist has actually gone through there and led worship there. Like Bethel Music, Chris Tom, like all of them, Planet Shaker, because they're just like known as this wild group of believers that do this thing called Camp Fest. And they've done it for now 24 years. And so what's wild about this is I'm there with them, and they're just all these beautiful, incredible people that one day I hope that in some measure you might get to meet. And we're there, and they're telling me the story about Camp Fest, and they're like, yeah, every year, about over 10 years ago now, they're like, every year it would rain. It just rain, like, and they'd have young people. It was a Youth for Christ ministry. They'd have young people from all over the country and all over that area of the world, different countries, drive all the way to Slovakia to come be a part of these giant worship events. And then they would get saved, and they'd have all these stuff. They had to set up like a demon tent at the back of the property, and they would call it, like they call it, I think, just freedom tent. But they were like, it's the demon tent. And it was just a really fun, and they just got to see so many young people come into the kingdom and get free. It was beautiful. And 10 years, they're like, it rained every year. And I was like, okay. And then they're like, and then we prayed. Because it would get flooded and muddy, and people would go home and they'd get sick. And their prayer team were like, no more. So they walked their entire property, anointed, I think, almost every acre with oil. They just like got proper charismatic about it. And they just did the whole 40 acres. And since then, every time they do their Camp Fest, it has not rained. And I'm hearing these stories, and I'm like, I actually need a bigger measuring cup. Hey? Because God himself actually wants to come and ignite us, because the faith and the measure of faith that you have here right now is not enough for the salvation of Peterborough. And it needs to be. Hey? Like, our faith hinges literally on a man coming back to life. And so we actually, I think where I'm getting to tonight is just this, that by the gospel itself and what Jesus has provided, you have been invited into great faith. Great faith. Because you haven't entered with your own, you've been entered into the completeness of what he's provided. And so it's actually proper for you to start to believe and think about your life as like, when I lay my hands on someone to pray, it's not just me going through the actions. It's actually the Son of God, the hope of glory in and through me. I am the body of Jesus. And I promise you, like, I'm going to start to wrap with this, because really what I want to do is just invite us to go, like, we need to pray and ask him to actually move in our nation. And actually increase our ability to walk as he walked. And Jesus of Nazareth went around doing good and healing all those who were oppressed of the enemy. And then 1 John says that he went and he destroyed the works of the devil. And that same fight that was in the Son of God to bring the rest and perfect will of heaven to earth, he actually wants to release upon you so that you would, as a son or a daughter, carry that fight of heaven. Does that make sense? I was going somewhere. I was going to share yeah, that just this one story, and just as by way of encouragement, because I've just been so rocked with it. So I apologize that I don't quite have the right language yet. So if you'll entertain me, I'm going to try to put language to this thing that I've been seeing in the Word. But in the book of Nehemiah, we heard Nate and Jess just a couple weeks ago praying, and God just dropped this on me. But it's this beautiful thing where Nehemiah, he hears someone comes and he's like, hey, give me a report from Jerusalem. And he hears about the walls being down and it just hasn't been restored yet. And his heart breaks. And then he goes to prayer and he prays for about 3 to 4 months. He just becomes obsessed. Like this prayer, he embodies this prayer. And he takes it to the Lord. And at the end of kind of like halfway through chapter 1, he says this thing where he starts telling the Lord about this Mosaic covenant. And he's like, and you said, and then he's actually then starts to quote David's or God's covenant with David and about the temple. And he's like, if we return, it says like, you'll return to us. Amen. And all of a sudden it was like this moment, because his prayer says like, be attentive to the prayer of your servant. And I think, and I would propose that Nehemiah in this moment realized that God can't lie. And Nehemiah was an Israelite. So the promise of God blessing Israel didn't have to come through many. It could come through one. Hey? And he's like, be attentive to the prayer of your servant, realizing that God was not restrained by a whole crew, the whole nation. It wasn't like the nation was seeking God in that moment, but he was. And God can't lie. So him being an Israelite knew that the promise could be afforded to him. And so he got personal with it. And he made it his own. And I'm sharing that to say, like, God needs you to change one more. Like the world, like history has proven that when believers go after this, history's changed. And it's beautiful right now because in the last year, we've just, like, our lives, like we were in a room in Moncton, Nate and Jess trying to lead worship over some of the loudest screaming demons I've ever. We're doing this event called Every Disciple Sent, right? And then the fight of God came into us to see people free. And this beautiful girl who was just being afflicted by the enemy just started to scream. And we got the joy of just watching some of our team stay with her until she got freedom. So there's fight in the family of God. And so I would love to pray because we've just set out on this wild journey that, like, we intend to see Canada changed. We intend to see it change because in the sending of each of you, having an understanding and a revelation that it's him who now lives in and through you, it means when you're out, when you're here, the party of heaven now that like beats in your chest can actually be manifested. Because the enemy would like you to think that he still has that authority. He would love for you to think that. And it's just not true anymore. And if you get personal with this thing and let it become the rudder in which you only see him, you will raise a testimony so loud and so compelling that a man who's never been to church gets saved because his sister saw a Billy Burke meeting. And that you would let the responsibility of what you've encountered in the Lord, every time he's answered a prayer, done a miracle, that responsibility, you would actually take serious and go, I'm going to, like you'd look at yourself and say, I owe the world an encounter with God. And I'm going to see Jesus get the reward for his suffering. Hey? It's not mine. I stole it, but I love it. Right? Because it's, yeah.